two, one, and welcome back, everyone. This is another edition of the Hear It from the Pen series of the Yellow Book Road podcast. My guest today is Don Brown, who's had written this particular book here, Nine Guiding Principles to Enact Change. And a lot of it will be based off of Florida politics, but also Florida insurance, which drives a lot of what happens in the United States. So, Don, welcome to the Hear It from the Pen series.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience today.
So, Don, jumping right in, your book starts talking about your rural Florida background and upbringing. Before we jump deep into the book, you talk about this in your book. Can you talk about how those early experiences shaped your approach to public service?
Well, I think we all can admit that when we think back about our childhood, there were certain things that started framing our worldview, if you will. And when I think back of one of the reasons I wrote the book is I wanted to tell the story of my childhood. My parents were wonderful parents. We lived in a small community. It was back during the day where the community would take care of the kids if need be. If I left home and went up to the neighbor's house and I got in trouble, they'd discipline me just like my mother and daddy would. But some of the things that I remember most were the lessons that I learned from mom and dad. Two in particular that I'll share with you real quick. My dad worked an outside job. My mother worked at home. There were six of us children, and I was the only boy, five girls and one boy, which explains a lot about my personality. I got picked on a lot, but the girls were older than me, except for my baby sister. But Mama and I were responsible for a vegetable garden that helped supplement the family's income. And I had long days in the hot, sweaty garden with mom, and it was there that we had long conversations, and she taught me a lot about wisdom, about hard work, about resilience, about keeping your word, being on time, and that sort of thing. And one other funny story that I tell about my dad was every year during Little League season, I always wanted to go play Little League. And he wanted me to water the sweet potato plants in the garden. And so there was a tension between me and him. So I would be in the garden hurrying as fast as I could to get through so I could go play ball. And one day he came by and he warned me. He said, when you water those plants, you pour the water down beside the plant. Don't pour it on top of them. I got in a hurry, poured the water on top of them again,
Uh,
me a second time. The third time he came by, he took the bucket out of my hand, dumped the bucket of water on my head. It was shock to me, like anybody would be with drenched in water. He asked me how I felt, and I said it didn't feel real good. And he said, "Well, that's how those plants feel. When you water those plants, you put the water by the plant." So, I guess the moral to that story is it was a lesson in taking pride in what you do the job right. If it's worth doing right. I've heard that millions of times. But it was just simple little experiences like that that began to shape my view of the world and the importance of good ethics.
how did you get into politics?
Well, that's a kind of a interesting story. The I had no idea that I would ever want to be in politics, notwithstanding the fact that I was in politics in high school. I was the senior class president. And reflecting back on that, that didn't seem to be a clue that I'd ever be in politics. But I had a friend who constantly reminded me that we needed good people in work in the legislature, and he finally convinced me to consider it. And it also was at the tail end of a tragedy. 7 years before I ran for office, I lost my teenage son in a tragic automobile accident. And during those 7 years, I was not very productive, to say the least. My wife did everything she could to keep the insurance agency going, but I was sort of checked out mentally. And it was politics that sort of captured my attention and sort of began to draw me back in to the real world. And it also involved something that happened in 19 it would have been 1983, I believe. We purchased our insurance agency, and it was financed by USF&G, a company that is familiar to a lot of people who've been in the business for a long time. There was a contingency in the finance contract that if I didn't provide 25% premium growth every year, there would be a penalty, an interest penalty. If for those who were around back then, interest rates were sky high, and they had financed the purchase of the agency for 7%. The year after we signed the contract in October, the legislature met in the spring, and they passed a bill mandating a 25% rate rollback in general liability insurance.
Mm.
Turns out there was a conflict between the trial lawyers and the insurance industry. No, nothing new about that conflict. But the legislature threw them a bone, threw the trial lawyers a bone, and just arbitrarily rolled rates back. Well, that meant that I couldn't meet the contingency in my contract, and the insurance company decided to stick to the contract. And for the 7 years that we used to pay off the insurance agency, we racked up tens of thousands of retroactive interest adjustments. And it just really taught me the lesson that the legislature quite often makes arbitrary decisions and they don't have a clue how it impacts the real people in the real world. And that was the two motivating factors that caused me to get involved in politics. I desperately wanted to do something that would have made my son proud. And it drove me to be pretty deliberate in my legislative efforts. Some thought I was quite intense, but that was a real motivation for me.
Yeah. So you were an insurance agent. You clearly felt the effect of legislative actions on your particular business. When you went into the legislature in Florida, did you find that insurance was the area you began to lean towards, or does the legislature have the kind of their own politics as well and bureaucracy, and you got assigned to whatever you got assigned to?
In most cases, when you have a change, an election, it's usually coincides with a change in speakers of the House, leadership in the House. And generally speaking, I don't know of an exception to this, but speakers will ask all of their members, particularly their new members, what committees they want to serve on. That's a very important first step because you get to drill down deep in those committees. And of course, my choice, because of my professional background, was to serve on the insurance committee. And there were several other committees that I served on as well. But I was assigned to the insurance committee the first year. And back then, the hot issue was no fault, PIP. And we did a bill that year, and it sort of gave me a taste of how the legislature functions and the things that constitute a successful negotiation for the passage of a bill. Of course, most of your readers will know this, most of your viewers will know this, but in order for a bill to become law, it must pass in the House, and it must pass in the Senate, and it must be signed by the governor. So it's a long process, and it's deliberative and requires a lot of work on the bill sponsors.
So your particular story about getting active in politics centered around the rollback. Um, you had mentioned it was kind of arbitrary in the way that they did that. So now you're participating in this. Did you find that there was insurance is really important to the state of Florida? Did you find that there was like a lot of arbitrary decision making that was occurring? And what did you do about that?
Well, there were arbitrary. There was many cases where decisions were made based upon um, personally held biases. Um, there are there's some psychological considerations. Humans, by their very nature, want to sort of uh, stay with the current status quo. In fact, there's a term in psychology called a status quo bias. Um, they know what we have now, and they tend to want to not get very far from that, and that prohibits some creative thinking with regard to policy and with regard to regulation. So I developed a strategy early on about whenever I viewed public policy questions about asking the question, what is the problem? Not what is the symptom of the problem. And let me illustrate by saying this. In Florida today, one of the hot issues is the price of homeowners insurance. Well, people would say the price of homeowners insurance is the problem. And I would say, no, it's the symptom of a problem. Well, if the price of insurance is not the problem, if it's the symptom, what is the problem? And you really have to do some hard work and some research to get to the root cause of what the problems are, whether it's insurance or whether it's legal reform or whether it's public policy on healthcare or whatever. You have to ask yourself those hard questions. So I developed a strategy of trying to identify what the root problem was. And in Florida, as it relates to homeowners insurance, I've come to the conclusion that there are two main problems. One is hurricanes. So I would have proposed a bill that would have just prohibited hurricanes. Silly idea. You can't do that. It doesn't work. What's the second problem? Stubborn human behavior. We want to live in paradise. We want to build in very dangerous places. And if we can, we'd like somebody else to pay for it. Just the risk that we take has not been properly communicated to us by the policy that we pass because we're constantly trying to drive down the price when we haven't yet gone to the trouble of driving down the cost. So, what is the solution to our problem? It's building our homes more safely and being more wise about where we put those vast assets, and tinkering with the system, flipping switches, turning knobs, pulling strings is what the legislature tends to want to do, but that is nothing but just sort of trimming around the edges. And they don't want to do the hard work, which is unpopular. And that's look at building codes, look at management of growth, and ask difficult questions about where should we build and how much it's going to cost to do that. That's a long answer, but um,
It's a good answer though, and um, it is difficult for politicians to make unpopular decisions, even if they're right, right?
yes.
And so, this is a good segue into what you do today on a day-to-day basis, which is dealing with building codes. Can you describe to the audience what your role is today?
Well, after I left the legislature, never again did I dream that I would be asked to serve in a consulting role. But in the aftermath of 2007 special session, when the legislature passed a bill called House Bill 1A that significantly expanded the government's role in homeowners insurance. I was very much opposed to that. I had just been appointed by then Speaker Marco Rubio to be the chairman of the council that was going to oversee this process. He and I had long conversations about how we were going to tackle this very difficult issue. We came to an agreement on a set of 9 guiding principles, which is the title of the book. Um, but it was difficult to keep people focused on the principles that we agreed to. But when it came time to pass policy, they wanted to have it the old way. Make a long story short, that didn't turn out well. Um, in fact, we passed a bill that I was very much opposed to. After that passed, I felt a strong need to, because I couldn't do what the speaker was asking me to do, I gave him my resignation as the chairman of the committee. He rejected it. A week later, they asked me again for that letter. So that created a scenario where there was a lot of people watching as spectators that knew that we did the wrong thing in House Bill 1A, and there was only two of us that voted no in the entire legislature, which created some notoriety, I suppose. My clients 2 years later asked me would I be willing to represent them in a consulting role, and to continue to advocate the policies that I had tried to advocate when I was a legislator. So today, I'm a consultant. That's a fancy way of saying I do some lobbying. And then most recently, I got interested in telling my story in the book. I had collected notes for many years. Um, every speech I ever made or every presentation, formal presentation I ever did, I had kept, fortunately, in the computer. So one day I thought, well, why not take those messages and write a book about it? And I toyed with that idea for 6 or 7 years. Then last December, something clicked, and I sat down and got serious. I wrote the book, and it was published in July. And so I'm now an author. Since I wrote that book, I have 13 more books that I've written but hadn't been published yet. They're in the queue, so to speak. So it's like somebody took the top off the box and I can't stuff it all back in. So I've got a lot that I want to say, and this is a good venue to do it, write a book.
What is your current role around Florida building codes?
Around the Florida Building Code, there's two things actually. I was appointed by Governor, well, the governor before our current one, Governor Scott. Governor Scott, forgive me for that momentary lapse of memory, but I was appointed to the Florida Building Commission. So since 2000 and about 13, I believe, I've served on the Florida Building Commission and was just recently reappointed by Governor DeSantis. So that's given me a new perspective on the importance of building strong. I was also appointed by Governor Scott to the role of the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund Advisory Council. And I have at least once served as chair of that role too, of that council, of that advisory council. So those are two things that I do in addition to my advocacy before the legislature and before the executive branch.
And when are you going to find time for writing, Don? That's
My wife asks me, complains about the 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning um, end of days. It's taken a lot of extra time, but when you're passionate about something and you're willing to commit yourself to it, then you find a way.
yeah. And we're gonna go deeper into the book, but hanging on to the importance of what you saw early on in your legislative career, you've really like latched on to the one lever that we have to we want to live in paradise, but we also want our the cost of our structures to be inexpensive. And there's a conflict that's there. The one thing we do have is building codes, and I think Hurricane Andrew was a big wake-up call for building codes. And now Florida has the strongest building codes in the country. But I would argue that South Florida has the strongest building codes in the country, and we still have old inventory in North Florida and not the same building codes. You would think we would learn our lessons from now Michael and Milton and Helene and other storms that do hit Central and Northern Florida. Why has it been so challenging for Florida, especially Northern Florida now, to enact stronger building codes?
Well, the first argument that you will hear is if you enact stronger building codes, it will drive up the cost of housing. You hear that from the Florida realtors. You hear that from the contracting industry in Florida. Two things I would say is number one, excellence in one area is no excuse for mediocrity in another. If there is improvements that can be made, particularly if you can show that they're cost effective, that they're not expensive, then there's just really no excuse not to do that. The other thing that I would say is there's a factor of human nature involved here. And I've been driven, my thinking about all these issues have been significantly influenced by a philosopher back in the 1800s, a fellow Frenchman by the name of Frederick Bastiat. And he made
Mhm.
this observation about human nature. He said that there is this common tendency among all people. When they can, they choose to live and prosper at the expense of others. By human nature, we want something at the very minimum cost that we can get it at. And if somebody else will help subsidize it, that's even better. Now, most of us experience that nature in everyday activities, but we don't commonly recognize why we're behaving that way. It's inherent in us. And to overcome that nature, the legislature has to be aware of it and has to not pass policies that cross subsidize insurance of all things, not create a negative signal to the consuming public that where you're fixing to build and how you're fixing to build is going to cost you more. The legislature is motivated to drive the costs down without regard to the risk. And that's where we come up real short quite often. It's not popular to tell someone that they're not paying enough. It's not popular to say that
Yeah.
we're going to make people in one area of the state pay more so that people that live on the coast can pay less. But we've got some serious problems to solve here, and we're going to have to get honest about the real cost of living in paradise.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that changes in building codes in the short term will raise the cost. But to your point, I think what it does is negate the cost savings over time. You get with stronger properties, you get
Mhm.
less damage, therefore fewer claims that are
Yes.
associated with that, and that should by all economic reason translate into lower premiums over time
Yeah.
if you can get the full inventory up to those building codes. And the uh, I think the lessons are clear. We've seen it in Irma, in Ian, and on basically in Michael in particular, where Cat 5 made landfall in the Panhandle, and there's that photo of that one property that's standing all by itself, built to really strong code and everything else around it is gone, sort of thing. And it's like building codes work. They save property, they save lives, and in the long term, you should see reduced costs. And Don, I live in South Florida. I would say that the supply chain adapts to it. So yes, the short term, you will see more cost, but man, Don, they're building HOAs here. I can't believe how fast they can pop those things up. And
Wow.
they're all Cat 5 resistant properties.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you would mention that one home that survived Michael. And I would just simply say to you, that's not a good example. And let me tell you why. The owners of that home spent a couple of $100,000 on that home to build it to a higher standard. Well, the average person looks at that kind of cost and says, I can't do that. Let me tell you a better example. Right down the street from that home, there was a subdivision, a Habitat for Humanity subdivision. How Habitat for Humanity builds homes is they bring in casual labor. They bring in people who know how to drive a nail, but they don't know the code. So in that Habitat for Humanity subdivision, volunteer labor didn't know any better, and they put in too many nails and too many screws and too many braces. And guess what? That subdivision survived and exceeded the performance of building code homes. The second thing that I would say is that when I was on the building commission, we contract with the University of Florida. After every storm, the engineering department does a post-storm assessment. Dr. David Pravat leads that effort each year. He was giving a presentation to the building commission, and he made a comment about this super performance of homes that were built above the code and piqued my interest. I asked him afterwards if he would be willing, if we could fund a study to go to the marketplace and catalog all of the current construction techniques that are not required by the code but that increase the performance of these homes. He said he would be glad to do it. We funded the study. He did it. We've got a catalog of the construction techniques that would improve our outcomes, and it's sitting on the shelf. And my current campaign is to get people to take that off the shelf. He calculates all of the paybacks. You're absolutely correct. It pays for itself over time, and it's sitting there on the shelf. In fact, I wrote another white paper that deals with Code Plus, is the concept that I call it. It's above the code. It's not expensive. It has a tremendous payback time. The benefits are multiple. And why the building commission wouldn't adopt it was a real mystery to me. I made the motion. I asked them to implement it, and they chose to turn it down. I asked them why. They said, well, they were afraid that it would create liability on their part if they built a home to the regular code. And then somebody came back later and said, well, why didn't you offer me the Code Plus? Well, in the insurance business, we know the answer to that question. You explain it to them, and if they reject it, then you get a sign off. If the Code Plus is optional,
Yep.
we could pass it on a mandatory basis. But then again, you would get these cries of cost too much. Well, again, excellence in one area is just no excuse for mediocrity. When it's low hanging fruit, we ought to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Don, I'm going to bounce back into the book. It's 9 guideline principles. I'm gonna create a shortcut in the show notes for anyone that's listening. We're not gonna go into all 9. Are there any one or two guiding principles that you think, for the audience sake, like they can understand it and they can implement it and make it effective?
I just happen to have the book with me, and the 9 guiding principles. At the time that I did this, there were 10 of them, and let me flip there, and I've mismarked my book. The 9 guiding principles. I don't want to waste any more of your time, but it's basically some of the principles that we've already talked about, and that is, um, it's perfectly fine for people to build anywhere they want to. Just don't expect somebody else to pick up the tab. Um, and simple things like that. If you're going to, well, I hate that I can't put my finger on that particular place. Let me see if I find it here. No.
And Don, I'm gonna edit this, so don't
Okay.
worry about the pause. I'm gonna
Okay.
clean this up.
Let me
So take
flip.
your time.
Okay. Um,
Well, Don, while I have you, it's page 151.
151.
Prin Principle 1, pay for hurricane risk with private capital rather than public debt. That is actually one of my favorite ones.
Yeah,
And I would even add to that, Don. Principle 1, I think, is vital for property and real estate in the state of Florida. But going beyond that, private capital, I would add the word global private capital. It's huge. We're essentially subsidizing, our insurance is subsidized by global capital. We have foreigners who are paying for the claims and the insurance of the marketplace. And I bet most consumers of insurance in the state of Florida, I bet most of the legislature don't realize that most of the capital that's going to pay for claims comes from places like Bermuda.
absolutely. And, we don't have a healthy appreciation for what that really means. And to
Mhm.
illustrate that principle, the principle of distributing risk across the globe, I like to remind legislators of the comparison between the New Zealand earthquakes
Yeah.
and earthquake and tsunami that happened in Japan. The New Zealand nation decided to spread their risk or distribute their risk through the mechanisms of reinsurance. And the devastation that the earthquake caused was unaffected by that. But what was affected by that was their recovery. The inflow of capital into their economy significantly reduced their trade deficits. It significantly boosted their economy, and they were able to recover faster and get back to normal. The contrast to that was Japan, who made a policy decision to self-insure, to retain the risk. And they are still struggling even till today, based on a decision that they made to embrace risk, to concentrate risk, and to retain risk. We have to be careful in Florida that we don't become resentful of those capital investors who are willing to lend us their money and their capital. That's not the way to look at the situation. They are friends of ours who are willing to share the risk with us. And just the common principles of risk management tells us not to embrace risk and concentrate risk, but to spread it across the globe. That is the least expensive way to ensure these risky decisions that we make in Florida. There are other ways that companies can finance that risk. All of them are more expensive. So reinsurance is an important part, and it's something that you are correct. I don't believe legislators or consumers really understand the dynamic there. And my job in writing is to try to help them understand that. Reinsurers
Yeah.
are,
And Don, that came up recently as well. The bill never, or the proposed bill never got really far, but there was a proposal to turn Citizens into the wind pool. Basically, allow all wind coverage to route through Citizens. And part of the rationale was, hey, we should be keeping Florida premiums in Florida. And,
it's
and
exactly,
I don't think there's an understanding of like, well, it's actually better to allow the premiums to leave to foreign entities because they're going to be picking up the losses too.
it's exactly backwards. And I don't mean to insult anyone or to cast dispersions, but that idea, let me speak not of the person, but the idea reminds me of an old saying. All my life I've heard about people putting their foot in their mouth. And all my life I've heard about people shooting themselves in the foot. But it's rare to see somebody put their foot in their mouth and then shoot themselves in the foot. It reminds me of that. It's just backwards. Risk management 101 tells us to not concentrate risk, to find ways to distribute risk. It's just very short-sighted. That bill will be reintroduced this year. It's already been filed, if I'm not mistaken. And the legislature could be tempted to think that it's an easy way out, that they let citizens insure the risk and we can control the price of citizens, but they can't control the losses of citizens. And until we can drive losses down, we can't long term drive prices down. We can play games for a season. We can play games for a while until the bill comes due. Then we're going to be in trouble. In fact, I've got an illustration in my book. I hope people will get it and read that illustration about living on credit. It's always better to finance risk with capital. When we consume the risk now in hopes that we're going to pay for it later, it's going to bite us, just like your credit card bill will bite you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is inevitable that $100+ billion
Yeah,
hurricane is going to happen. It's inevitable. We don't know when. Could be next year. It could be 100 years from now. We don't know.
right.
And it is proper risk management to make sure that we can handle that. And as of right now, that sort of event would put not only Citizens under, but now you're talking a political process of assessments where your auto insurance is going to go up, your workers' comp's going to go up. Anything that touches property or casualty is going to have an assessment on it. It's essentially a tax. And I really worry about the fiasco that comes with that. Like they're going to be the old saying, peasants with pitchforks will be people are going to be irate, and I would almost counsel folks to think like that's events going to happen. Just have let's have the global marketplace fund it for us and just consider our premiums kind of an amortization of that funding.
Yeah. The most expensive homeowners insurance that anyone can ever purchase is from a company who can't pay their claims.
Hmm.
it becomes the most expensive. It doesn't matter about the price of the premium. It matters in the end whether or not they can pay the claim. And it's so, and again, we get back to human nature. I want something now and I want it for as cheap as I can get it. And if somebody else will drive the price down for me, fine. But I don't give a lot of thought. It's part of our nature to the end. And that is, if you buy insurance from a company that can't pay the claims, it's the most expensive insurance you can buy.
Yeah, yeah. Don, I want to finish off with your methodology for the book. We've had a lot of other writers, and I speak to a lot of aspiring writers. This is a beefy book. This is well over 500 pages, right? You said that you wrote this in about 6 months. Aside from staying up till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, what was your process and procedure to get it in? Are you a typewriter kind of guy? Did you use a word processor? How did you edit this thing? Walk us through those 6 months.
Well, like I said earlier, I had been working on trying to come up with a manuscript for several years. So there was a lot of the work that had been done. When I say the work, there was a lot of resource material that I had available, speeches that I had written, policy papers that I had written, white papers that I had written. So I had that collection of material. And it was in the beginning just the process of trying to find some theme or some way of communicating that information. That's why the last half of the book is titled Essays about Insurance. They were disjointed in many cases, so I tried to mash them together in a way that they tell a story about policy, insurance policy in Florida. The other two parts of the book, it's really three books in one. And the first part of the book is telling my childhood story. And why did I want to tell that? Well, number one, it's important to me. It's important to my children and my grandchildren, but it also explains in some way, or I hope that it explains the intensity with which I approached the policymaking endeavor that I undertook later. I think there was a lot of things that happened to me during my early years that shaped my way of seeing the world and my values about hard work and resilience. So I told my childhood stories, tried to use humor. I've learned the hard way that it's rare for someone to listen to you if you just are going to pontificate on an academic level. They will remember what you say, however, if you use some humor and if you use some casual language. And that was one of the tricks or techniques I would say that I learned early in my legislative career. When I got to Tallahassee, one of the first things I learned was is I was not the smartest one there. There's some incredibly bright, motivated people that was there, and I had to come up with a strategy to compete in that environment. And one of the strategies that I developed was use the common sense that mom and dad taught me, use some humor, don't take things so literally. Use illustrations to make your points, and people will listen. So I wrote the story of my childhood. This middle part is the story of my legislative career. I thought it was important to say the things
Mhm.
that I say in there. Part of it was very controversial, but and then finally all of the essays that I had written. So yeah, it's a beefy book. It's probably more than the average person will want to read. But in fact, I'm very close to publishing three new books that are basically this book in three parts. One part tells my youthful stories, and one part tells my legislative stories, and then the essays are in a separate book. Um, but I just got started, and I did it on the computer. And I use things like Grammarly to do some of my editing, make sure my grammar was correct. I did use an editor. The man that edits my stuff is actually in Atlanta. And then we just went from there. We self-published through Amazon, KDP, and anybody can do this if they'll set their heart to it. It does take long hours. It does take a lot of work, but they can do it. If I can do it, just a country boy from Northwest Florida, they can do it.
Well done. We have an audience full of insurance professionals who also like to read, and we always say readers or leaders. You can also actually flip that around, leaders or readers. It goes both ways as well. So, Don, thank you very much. I'm going to sh put the link to this to Amazon, some show notes around this. Um, I will try to pull out some insurance tidbits because I think our audience will appreciate that and get them to buy the book. But appreciate you very much coming on the Hear It from the Pen series and discussing this with us.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. This is a message that I'm passionate about, and I don't know if I'll ever retire. I love doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Godspeed, Don.
Thank you.